All right, let's jump right in. We are tackling one of the biggest, most fundamental questions in all of history. Why did the world turn out the way it did? And why, for the last 200 years or so, has the West been so dominant?
So to really get our heads around this puzzle, you just have to look at these two images. We've got two scenes here, right? Both involve British and Chinese ships, and both are from around the same time. But man, do they tell two completely different stories. It's like a tale of two realities.
Just imagine, for a second, one of those alternate timelines. A huge, powerful Chinese armada sails right up the River Thames. A defeated Queen Victoria is forced to kneel, and her husband, Prince Albert, he gets carted off to Beijing as a guarantee of good behavior. I mean, think about that. A world completely turned on its head.
But that's not what happened. Not even close. In our reality, it was British gunboats forcing China's surrender during the Opium Wars. This event kicked off what is now known in China as the Century of Humiliation. And get this, instead of Prince Albert being taken to Beijing, a tiny Pekingese dog literally looted from the Emperor's summer palace was given as a gift to Queen Victoria. And her name for the dog? Ludi. You really can't make this stuff up.
So that's the real mystery, isn't it? Why did history unfold in a way that brought Ludi the dog to Britain and not Prince Albert to China? Figuring this out, really digging into this puzzle, does more than just explain the past. It tells us so much about our world today and maybe, just maybe, where we're all headed next.
Okay, so for a couple of centuries now, some of the smartest people around have been wrestling with this question. And, their answers usually fall into one of two big camps.
So in one corner, you have what we can call the long-term lock-in folks. Their argument is basically that the West's rise was inevitable. Destiny. Something that happened way, way back in the past set the West on a path to dominance, and it was locked in. Then, in the other corner, you have the short-term accident crew. They say, no way, the West and East were pretty much the same until recently, and the West just got lucky. Its rise was a total fluke, a historical accident.
Now, the classic lock-in argument usually boils down to one thing: technology. The Industrial Revolution. It happened in the West. They got the factories, the steam engines, and of course the weapons. As the saying goes, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. Game over, right? The West's power was just unstoppable. But hold on a second. That just leads to another question, doesn't it? Why did the Industrial Revolution happen in the West? And this is where the lock-in theorists really dig deep. Some say it was the unique legacy of ancient Greece. Democracy, philosophy, reason. Others point to Europe's geography, all those mountains and rivers that created tons of competing states, which spurred innovation. The core idea, though, is that something in the West's distant past set it on a completely different and ultimately superior trajectory.
Okay, but there's a pretty massive problem with that whole theory. Because if you actually look at the long sweep of history, for a very long time, the East was way, way ahead technologically. Let's go back to the early 1400s. Europe is just starting to figure out oceanic voyages. Meanwhile, China? They're launching naval fleets that were, without a doubt, the greatest the world had ever seen.
And just look at the numbers here. It's absolutely mind-boggling. Admiral Zheng He's expedition had 27,000 sailors. 27,000. Columbus, nearly a century later, had 90. Zheng He had hundreds of ships. Columbus had 3 little boats. In fact, some of China's ships were so massive that Columbus's entire flagship, the Santa Maria, was shorter than the rudder on one of Zheng He's treasure ships. So this idea that the West had some kind of permanent long-term technological advantage, it just doesn't hold water.
All right, so if a long-term lock-in doesn't work, what about the other side? This is where the short-term accident theory comes in. These historians argue that, look, as late as 1750, the most developed parts of the East and West were pretty much on par. They say the West only shot ahead because of a string of incredible lucky breaks. First, discovering the Americas, with all its resources. And second, the sheer geological fluke that Britain was sitting on top of massive, easy-to-reach coal seams right at the moment the steam engine was invented.
So what's the verdict? Was it destiny or just dumb luck? The fact that you have incredibly smart people looking at the exact same evidence and coming to completely opposite conclusions, well, that kind of suggests that something's wrong with the whole debate. Maybe both sides are missing the bigger picture. Maybe the question itself is flawed. And this is where we get to a really fascinating idea that tries to break this stalemate. Historian Ian Morris comes along and says, what if we stop just arguing about this? What if we try to measure it? A whole new way of looking at the problem.
So he develops this index for what he calls social development.
Now, this isn't about which culture is better or worse. It's a totally neutral score for a society's ability to, well, get stuff done. Can it harness energy? Can it build big cities? How good is it at making war or at processing information? It's a measure of raw capacity.
And here's where it gets really, really cool. He then crunches the numbers for both the East and the West, going back something like 15,000 years, and he plots it all on a graph. So, for the very first time, we can literally see the shape of history instead of just arguing about it. And what that graph shows is pretty shocking. It basically blows both of the old theories out of the water.
Just take a look. What the data shows is that yes, for most of the last 15,000 years, the West has had the higher score. So the short-term accident theory doesn't quite fit. But, and this is a massive but, it clearly wasn't a permanent lock-in either. Because for a huge stretch of time, more than 1,000 years, from roughly 550 to 1775, the East was actually in the lead. The lines literally cross.
So, what in the world is going on here? How do you explain this bizarre pattern of rising, falling, and crisscrossing? If it's not some ancient destiny, and it's not just a recent fluke, then what is the driving force of history?
Well, Morris suggests that history isn't random at all. He says it's governed by a few basic, predictable forces. Think of it like a toolkit. First up, biology. Basically, people are people. In large groups, we're all pretty much the same clever apes. Second, sociology. This one's great. He says history is driven forward by lazy, greedy, and frightened people who are always looking for easier, richer, and safer ways to do things. And third, geography. Location, location, location. Geography is what determines which group of people gets to push development forward at any particular time.
And that sociological part is really key. He calls it the paradox of development. Think about it. Our desire for an easier life pushes us to invent things and make progress. But every single time we solve a problem, that solution creates new problems. A better food supply leads to a bigger population, which leads to overcrowding and disease. Better communication leads to new kinds of conflict. It's a constant cycle that forces societies to either keep innovating or just stagnate and fall apart.
And this is where it all comes together in this brilliant idea. Geography drives social development, but social development determines what geography means. That's the whole ballgame right there. For thousands of years, the Atlantic Ocean was a giant, impassable barrier. But then, once your social development creates ships that can cross it, that same ocean becomes a superhighway for commerce and empire. Geography doesn't change, but what it means for humanity changes completely.
Okay, so this is a really powerful toolkit for understanding the past. But what's so cool about it is that it's not just about what already happened. It gives us a new way, a new lens, to think about what's happening right now and what might happen next.
Which brings us full circle, right back to the title of the book this is all based on. It's so important to remember. The title isn't Why the West Rules, period. It's Why the West Rules for Now. Those two little words at the end change everything.
Because those fundamental forces, they haven't gone anywhere. Biology, sociology, geography, they're all still at play. That paradox of development is still pushing us, creating new challenges with every solution. And think about how fast the meaning of geography is changing today with things like the internet, global supply chains, and climate change. The very same dynamics that let the West pull ahead centuries ago might just be setting the table for another big shift.
And so that leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. As our world keeps changing, as the very meaning of geography is being rewritten by technology and global challenges, are we about to see those historical lines cross again? Is this whole era of Western dominance just another chapter in a story that's far from over?